Welcome to today's podcast, which is hosted by DePaul University's Chaddick Institute. Our guest is David Hall, a widely respected leader in the intercity bus industry. Our main interviewer, Brian Antolin, is CEO of Kodo Travel. Joe Schwieterman, a DePaul professor, will also join the discussion. Professor Schwieterman is active in the Transportation Research Forum, a prominent organization devoted to studying all major modes of transport. Brian will now offer a few words on Mr. Hall's impressive backgrounds.
Thank you very much, Jessica. David Hall has worked in public transportation for nearly 3 decades, helping to shape how the riding public views and uses intercity bus transportation today. From his days as a fleet manager, helping to shape Greyhound's national network, to spearheading the launch and operation of BoltBus across the United States, David is a leader, innovator, and change maker. He is currently the principal at Fleet Modem, a transportation consultancy specializing in electric bus operations and innovative mobility tech solutions. So David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely. So we're going to dive right in. And you've worked in intercity buses and in this industry for 27 years, I believe it is. And what is the biggest change or shift in intercity transportation that you've seen since you started your career at Greyhound to present day?
Well, the most striking thing to me actually is just how much more customer friendly it has become over the years. I mean, it's really quite a transformation when you think about it. I started with Greyhound in 1993, and there was only one way to purchase a ticket at that time. You had to go to a brick and mortar station, stand in line, pay the ticket agent largely in cash, not even much credit was used, but that was the only channel basically to get your ticket. And it's really evolved quickly. I mean, even back in the early 90s, we had a telephone information center that was just that, for information. You couldn't even buy a ticket over the phone. In 98, we kind of pitched this as a team to the executive team of Greyhound to start selling tickets over the phone, and that was even received very coldly. I mean, ultimately we did it, of course, and very soon it was the largest sales channel that Greyhound had, even larger than New York City, was the phone center. But, you know, it was a slow adoption rate to slowly move from the brick and mortar environment, which of course is onerous on the customer, to more, you know, telephone sales and then digital channels, and then of course much more evolution lately that I'm sure we'll talk about a little further on in this podcast.
That's really interesting. This is Joe. And one thing I was so impressed with BoltBus and also with Megabus and some of the other discount city operators, and just how they're able to do things quickly. You know, in the old days, the Russell's guide scheduled to change every few months, and you could kind of roll things out fast, look at data, you know, not be sort of tied down to history. Share a little bit about your sense of how these new bus lines are able to innovate so quickly.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first part, Joe, is we wanted to be as frictionless as possible. I mean, keep the policies simple, keep it fairly easy on the consumer, be fairly customer friendly with refunds and stuff. Just be as absolutely easy to do business with as you can. It was kind of a Southwest Airlines concept or model, if you will, kind of translated over into the bus. And the second is, you're absolutely correct. I mean, with Bolt, 97 or 8% of the sales were online. So we had real-time access to data intraday to evaluate and think about things. And we did flex capacity to much larger degrees than we ever have. I mean, there's 52 weekends in a year, and we literally would have a different operating plan for almost every weekend. I mean, some weekends are a little busier than others. Some are holiday weekends. Obviously, you add flex capacity into those. And then some weekends were a little bit slower than norm, so you flexed in the other direction. But it was largely quantitatively data-driven decisions that really helped to drive the business and take care of customers.
Definitely. And just speaking on that point of the data-driven decisions and how revolutionary this was when Bolt first came out in 2008, And fast forwarding to now with everything that's happening with the pandemic and with travel being relatively depressed, as an avid observer of the industry, a lot of exciting developments up to this point. But what is the biggest trend that you see emerging within the intercity bus space as the industry and the world in general emerges into this new normal?
Well, right before the pandemic hit, I mean, there were a lot of, the evolution of the space was continuing. The digital channels had really expanded to, apps and things like that, and you could really buy a ticket in a multitude of ways. I mean, Greyhound was selling tickets at 7-Eleven, etc. I mean, tons of channels. And it was really interesting, and there was also a real expansion of the entertainment options on board the bus. I mean, infotainment and entertainment, and FlixBus was rolling out a really nice little package of things to entertain the customer and just add to the whole experience. The other thing I would say that I've been pleased with over the years is that, both the bus has gotten more comfortable, but it's also gotten dramatically more safe. I mean, there's compartmentalization in the bus now, and seat belts. Between those two things makes, the likelihood of tragedy to occur with a collision, takes it down dramatically. So some really, really nice, improvements in all aspects of the travel on the inner city space. I mean, it's really good stuff.
On that same note, but maybe on the other side of the coin, what are some of the problems or challenges that, bus operators face that maybe the public doesn't realize? Obviously, curb space can get political, other drivers. Tell us what things, really test bus operators to, keep the show going and do it smoothly.
Well, I mean, curb space, Joe, yeah, it can be political. I guess we'll touch on that in a sec. It's also a challenging operating environment. Obviously, you're open air typically. You're out in the elements, so to speak. So if it's rainy or hot, 50 hot people get on a bus, it's awfully hard to get the bus into a nice climate zone for the customers. It's actually quite of a challenge. But there's also, on a curb, you're also competing with other interests. I mean, in New York City, at one point, we were right by a subway entrance, which was not a good location because, there's a lot of cross traffic mixing with the passenger traffic waiting, and the space wasn't necessarily large enough for either. So when you blended the two together, it was a bit of a problem at points. I mean, you tried to mitigate that with maybe loading the bus a little early or staggering your schedules a little bit, but there was no way getting around. At 5 o'clock, there was a rush for the subway, and likely there was a rush for the bus. So, the curb space creates a lot of different challenges from a normal terminal operation, and there's also a lot of benefits to the curb. It can be, in that same case, being that close to the subway made connectivity and, interchange between the two modes seamless and extremely easy. So there was both a plus side and a downside. But the curb space can be very political. I will say we worked in maybe 42 municipalities, and all 42 were different in their approach and what you had to do to get permitted, or some cities didn't even permit you. They didn't care. I mean, it was just 42 different experiences to get your operation up and running in those cities. And you took them each as you went, and you went along. And some would change over time. New York City initially had one type of permitting process, and then over time, of course, with some regulation that came through the state level, that changed into a little bit different process. So it's kind of evolving, like transportation in general for all of us at all levels. It's evolving and has evolved, and I'm sure will continue to.
Dave, it's great that you bring up how the experience and how its impacts and effects on the municipalities and also the riding public. And When you think about buses, generally, it also equates to crowds. And crowds are something that is going to take a while for us to really see in return. You're no longer working as an operator in the industry, but if you were in this position where you have to bring a bus company back to life, so to say, what are the top 3 steps that you would take to help ease any fears or concerns related to getting back on a bus to travel for employees and passengers?
Well, I mean, it's somewhat the normal procedures for almost any business, I think, at this point, but you'd have to stress that you follow the CDC guidelines and that you take the necessary steps with sanitation and cleaning and those things. You'd also, of course, have to do health checks on the employees, but I realize everyone's doing this. I'm going to get to something a little more interesting in a second. So you'd have to do those things. You'd have to make sure your employees don't have a temperature. You'd have to sanitize everything, lots of PPE. And you'd have to make sure the customer knows and is aware of these things. And I would require the customers to wear a mask while traveling. I mean, we're wearing masks in enclosed space or even in outside spaces now, so certainly a mask would be appropriate. The other thing I would do is I would try to figure out my service and really press maybe more of a boarding time, boarding group kind of concept. I mean, we've done that before, and we were doing that, of course, for years. But even now, I would say, you're going to board at 15 minutes prior, and then try to have them adhere to that. To where you're not getting a group to even board, you're kind of getting more of a staged boarding over a 15 or 20 minute span, and then you depart. So I would try to do some, innovative things along those steps to mitigate the crowd size and help do those things. I mean, it's hard for a carrier to limit capacity because, truthfully, without higher capacities, on some trips you can't make money overall. So, but I think you can take a lot of steps otherwise to make the customers more comfortable and also help with mitigating the disease.
David, you said something there that's interesting, and Brian and I talk a lot about the demographics that are appeal to bus travel and those that are reluctant to give bus travel a try. And of course, in post-pandemic times, that's a whole new variable we're going to see. I don't think buses are positioned a whole lot worse than airlines in terms of fear because of the density on airlines. But before the pandemic, what encouraging signs did you see about new markets or types of markets that were willing to give intercity bus travel a try, maybe for the first time, or build it into their lifestyles, partly because of the quality of company like BoltBus, the services, but also just the general trends you see in the industry? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, right from the get-go, Joe, with Bolt, we were amazed at the change in demographic. Basically, we were attracting really a non-typical customer, but more of an educated, 65% or so of the Bolt ridership had a undergraduate degree or greater, which was a big departure for the space, just typically in general. And a lot of them, higher income levels too. And I think it was, as we touched on a little earlier, the frictionless kind of, commerce that it was. It's very easy to do business with, tries to be a little bit fun and have a little twinkle in its eye as it went about its business. We tried to hire drivers that were friendly and had a little sense of humor. And then we even coached. We did some coaching and training a little bit on being a little bit fun and having a sense of humor with the customers. So I think all those things kind of, it was a departure from normal in some respects. But, that whole time, and it was a lot of younger people, which to me was exciting because, you start with them when they're 18 and then you have them for a while and they like your service. So they kind of become customers for life, or at least certainly for a while. Then there's a replenishing set coming every year as young people go to school or move up out of their homes. And and move on with their life and grow and progress. I mean, there's like a regenerating customer set coming to you each year. So it was really fairly interesting and exciting. And the growth was huge in the space. I mean, it's, you know, from the middle 2000s to before COVID, I mean, we were really seeing continuous, as you know, growth in this space and lots of exciting things happening.
Definitely agree that the growth, especially in the early days, was, with lack of a better term, explosive. And part of it had to do with where we were in the economy. Part of it was the value proposition and how it really stuck to that group of people who really didn't consider buses before. And bringing that all back into perspective 12 years later, what do you see as the next step regarding getting more, aside from COVID, but getting more people to take buses? Is it trying to integrate an end-to-end solution, a door-to-door solution within intercity buses where it becomes more accessible? Or is it that intercity buses have to be on additional platforms to get more visibility? What do you see in terms of a general outlook and a future of what this industry has to do to attract more people outside of the whole COVID situation?
Well, I mean, yeah, we have to get beyond COVID for sure. And Joe kind of hit on it earlier. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty as we emerge, and, you know, it's obviously going to take a while to normalize. But I think a lot of the industry trends before COVID were encouraging and on the right track. I mean, there was more and more services kind of tailoring to market and not moving to full on demand, but close to on demand, you know, service where maybe it was weekend only, or maybe it was 3 or 4 days a week, but service was popping up between point to point or multi-points to a point, like New York City or Los Angeles or wherever, that less than daily, that we're serving new communities and still expanding. So that was all fairly exciting. I mean, Flix was doing some interesting things where it seemed like they were really quantitatively analyzing their traffic and flexing schedules, you know, in or out, which was very interesting and seemed to be, you know, long-term going to work really well before COVID hit. But I think, you know, moving more and more into the customer-friendly aspects, the infotainment, things like that. I think also as cities try to become a little more intermodal, I believe that's helpful too. And, you know, Philadelphia, if they do a 30th Street station someday, I mean, that would be helpful. And other communities continue to kind of bring intercity bus into the facilities where we can get more seamless connectivity with the transit net, is all very helpful as well. So I think it's got a bright future. I really do. I think it's got to get through COVID, and there may be a shakeout in the number of participants that will take a while, but eventually I think the space will return to being vibrant and have a good future going forward.
Well, David, we're down to our last 30 seconds or so. Do you want to just tell us some of the things you're excited to do in your consulting business or life after being in the grind of the day-to-day industry? What's on the agenda?
Well, Joe, 27 years with Greyhound were awesome, but, you know, I'm kind of excited to stay in the transportation and bus space, but kind of branch out a little bit. So I've started up Fleet Modem, which is going to be a transportation consultancy. It's really going to be kind of focused initially on the school and transit bus spaces as they move to transitioning to electric. I mean, possibly at some point, intercity might move to electric bus. But for school and transit, I think the technology is largely there today. The ranges work. You know, it's obviously a very quiet bus and a very clean bus in those urban and within city environments. So I think it's a good space to kind of go into, and I'm really, really excited to get deeper and deeper into it.
That's fascinating. It is going to be a technological different universe when intercity buses start looking to electric. I think in Europe there's some rollouts. Well, this has been a great discussion. I know Jessica, Brian, and I all agree this is a great way to have our first webinar to talk to somebody like you with your insights. Well, thank you for making the time and wish you luck with all this. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. And we're going to be doing this more through the Transportation Research Forum in the future as well. Please join us. And on behalf of all three, thank you and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It was my pleasure.